October 24th, 1944. The Vosges Mountains, France. Temperature near freezing. Conditions: zero visibility. To understand the rage of the 442nd Regiment, you first have to look at a map. Not a map of France, but a map of the United States. While Private First Class Sadao Munamori was digging a foxhole in the frozen mud of Europe, his mother was sitting behind barbed wire in the Manzanar internment camp in California. The U.S. government had branded them enemy aliens. They took their homes, they took their businesses, they locked them up because they looked like the enemy who bombed Pearl Harbor. But these men didn't riot, they volunteered. They demanded the right to fight. They wanted to prove their loyalty in blood. They were short men. The average height was 5'4", but they carried more ammunition and aggression than any unit in the European theater. Now they were in the Vosges Mountains, a place where sunlight goes to die. Dark pine forests, vertical ridges, and constant freezing rain. And they were walking into a meat grinder. The trap. 2 miles ahead, deep in the German lines, the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment was dying. They were Texans, the Alamo Regiment. Tall, corn-fed boys who had pushed too far and got cut off. 275 men were trapped on a ridge, surrounded by 6,000 German troops. These weren't conscripts, they were Gebirgsjäger, mountain hunters, and SS Panzer Grenadiers. They had the high ground, they had artillery, they had orders from Hitler himself. Take no prisoners, massacre the Americans to break their morale. The Texans were out of food, they were out of water, they were running out of bullets. General Dahlquist, the division commander, had sent 2 other white battalions to break through. They were chewed up and spat out. The Germans held the line like a steel wall. Dahlquist had only one card left to play: the Buddha heads, the 442nd. He called Colonel Virgil Miller. "Send the Japs in," Dahlquist ordered. "Get those Texans out. I don't care what it costs."
The Forest of Knives. October 26, 1944. The 442nd moved out. The forest was a nightmare. The trees grew so close together that tanks couldn't pass. It was an infantry fight, man against man. But the biggest killer wasn't the bullets. It was the tree bursts. The German artillery shells were set with time fuses to explode above the ground, in the canopy of the pine trees. When a shell hit a tree, it turned the wood into thousands of razor-sharp splinters. It was like being inside a blender. Sergeant Takata led his squad up the muddy slope. Crack, boom! A shell hit a tree directly above them. Wooden shrapnel, jagged and long as a spear, rained down. "Down! Get down!" Takata screamed. But there was no cover. The shrapnel pierced helmets, it pierced packs. One soldier, Private Tanaka, was pinned to the ground by a shard of wood through his shoulder. He didn't scream. He just gritted his teeth and tried to pull it out. "Leave it," Takata yelled, crawling over to him. "You pull it, you bleed out. Keep moving." They couldn't stop. The Texans were dying. Every minute the 442nd stopped to bandage a wound was a minute the Texans didn't have. The wall. They reached the main German defensive line. It was a ridge nicknamed Hell's Highway. The Germans had dug in deep. Machine gun nests every 10 yards, snipers in the trees, mines in the mud. The 442nd hit the wall. Machine gun fire swept the slope. It was a solid sheet of lead. K Company was in the lead. The captain shouted, "Charge!" They stood up and ran into the fire. Bodies fell like dominoes. The Nisei soldiers didn't retreat. When one fell, another stepped over him. A soldier named Barney Hajiro saw a machine gun nest killing his friends. He didn't look for cover. He became a berserker. He ran 40 yards across open ground, firing his BAR, Browning automatic rifle, from the hip. He jumped onto the ledge of the German nest. He killed 2 gunners point blank. He turned and killed 2 snipers on the flank. He was a one-man army. He signaled his squad forward. "Come on," Hajiro screamed. "They bleed just like us." They took the first ridge, but when they looked ahead, their hearts sank. There were 3 more ridges, and the Germans were reinforcing. The lost battalion was still a mile away, a mile of pure, concentrated death.
The Butcher's Bill. October 29th, 1944. The stalemate was bloody. The 442nd had advanced, but the cost was astronomical. Company I started with 185 men. They were down to 8. 8 men. General Dahlquist, sitting in his command post miles away, radioed the 442nd commander. "Keep moving," the general ordered. "The Texans are starving. I don't care about your losses. Take that hill." The Nisei soldiers heard the order. They looked at their dead friends, stacked like firewood in the snow. They looked at the German bunkers ahead. They didn't complain. They didn't riot. They just tightened their helmet straps. But the Germans had a surprise. From the mist, the rumble of heavy engines emerged. Panzer IV tanks. The Germans had managed to maneuver armor onto the narrow logging trails. A tank in a forest is a monster. It knocks down trees. It fires high explosive shells into foxholes at point-blank range. The Nisei had no air support. Too foggy. They had no tank destroyers. They had bazookas and guts.
The Banzai charge. The German tanks and infantry launched a counterattack. They were pushing the 442nd back down the hill. It looked like the end. The Americans were breaking. Suddenly, Private First Class Sadao Munamori stood up. He didn't run away. He ran toward the Germans. He threw a grenade. It hit a machine gun nest. Then something happened that had never happened on the Western Front. Someone yelled, "Banzai!" It started as a single voice, then a squad, then the whole regiment. "Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!" The cry echoed through the dark forest. The German SS troops froze. They knew that sound from newsreels about the Pacific. They thought they were fighting Americans. Why were they hearing the war cry of the Imperial Japanese Army? Fear, primal, confused fear gripped the Germans. The Nisei soldiers charged. They didn't fire their rifles. They fixed bayonets. They ran straight into the machine gun fire. They climbed over the tanks. It was a wave of pure suicidal aggression. During the charge, a German tank turned its turret to fire on the rushing infantry. A Nisei soldier named Bazooka Joe, not his real name, but a legend of the unit, stood his ground. He didn't take cover. He stood in the open, 20 yards from the tank. He aimed his bazooka. The tank fired its machine gun. Bullets kicked up mud around Joe's boots. Joe didn't flinch. He waited until the tank filled his sights. Whoosh! The rocket hit the tank's track. The track snapped. The tank spun around, exposing its weak rear armor. "Kill it!" Joe screamed. Other soldiers swarmed the tank, throwing grenades into the hatches. The SS, the elite of Hitler's army, turned and ran. They ran from the little men they had underestimated. The breakthrough. The charge carried them to the top of the ridge. The ground was littered with bodies, German and American, locked in death. Sergeant Takata, bleeding from a head wound, looked through the trees. Down in the valley below, he saw movement. Muddy foxholes, men waving weak hands. It was them, the lost battalion. They were alive. "We got 'em," Takata yelled. "We broke through." The radio operator called HQ. Objective sighted. Contact imminent. The 442nd didn't stop to celebrate. They walked down into the valley. They looked like ghosts. Their uniforms were shredded. Their faces were hollow. They had started the climb with 400 men in the assault wave. Now, looking around, Takata counted less than 100 standing. They had paid for every yard of ground with a gallon of blood.
The meeting. October 30th, 1944. The first Nisei soldier stumbled into the perimeter of the lost battalion. The Texans crawled out of their foxholes. They were bearded, starving, and out of ammo. They looked at their rescuers. They didn't see Japs. They saw brothers. A Texan major, tears streaming down his dirty face, grabbed the hand of a Japanese-American sergeant. "I never thought I'd be so happy to see anyone in my life," the major choked out. The Nisei soldiers didn't cheer. They were too tired. They opened their packs and handed out their rations. They gave their last cigarettes to the men they had just saved. It was a surreal scene in the middle of a frozen French forest. Men who would have been segregated in America, maybe even enemies on the street, were hugging and sharing food. The 442nd saved 211 Texans, but the cost was horrific. To save those 211 men, the 442nd suffered over 800 casualties. They traded 4 lives for 1. It was a math equation written in blood. The Parade of Ghosts. November 12th, 1944. 2 weeks later. The fighting in the Vosges was over. General Dahlquist ordered a review parade. He wanted to honor the 442nd for their bravery. He wanted a photo op. He ordered the entire regiment to assemble on a field. Colonel Miller marched his men out. They stood in formation. General Dahlquist arrived in his jeep. He stepped out, looking crisp and clean. He looked at the formation. He frowned. He turned to Colonel Miller and shouted, "Colonel, I ordered the entire regiment to assemble. Where are the rest of them?" Colonel Miller stared straight ahead. His eyes were wet. "Sir," Miller said, his voice breaking, "that is all of them. The rest are dead or in the hospital." The general looked again. He saw the massive gaps in the ranks. Companies that should have had 200 men had 15. Platoons were commanded by privates because all the officers were dead. For the first time, the general understood the price of his orders. He reportedly saluted the men, and for a moment he couldn't speak. He was reviewing a ghost army. The return. May 1945. The war ends. The 442nd returned to the United States. President Harry Truman invited them to the White House. He pinned the Presidential Unit citation on their flag. "You fought not only the enemy," Truman told them, "but you fought prejudice, and you have won." It was a nice speech, but the reality was harder. When Sergeant Takata got off the train in his hometown in California, wearing his uniform and his medals, he walked into a diner to buy coffee. The sign on the door said, "No Japs allowed." He had killed Nazis. He had saved Texans. He had bled for the Stars and Stripes. But to some people, he was still the enemy. He didn't burn the diner down. He walked away with his head high. He knew who he was. He was an American, and he had the scars to prove it. The legacy. History has a way of correcting mistakes.
The 442nd Regimental Combat Team became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history for its size and length of service. 21 Medals of Honor, 9,486 Purple Hearts, 4,000 Bronze Stars. They were the Purple Heart Battalion. They proved that loyalty isn't about the shape of your eyes or the color of your skin. It's about what you are willing to die for. Their motto was "Go for broke." They bet everything on America, and they won. If this story of ultimate sacrifice moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel. We will never let their names be forgotten. Go for broke.